Welcome, everyone, to MALDEF's 50th anniversary kickoff and panel discussion here in San Antonio, Texas. My name is Thomas Saenz. I am President and General Counsel of MALDEF, and I have the great pleasure of introducing this kickoff discussion. 50 years ago, in August 1968, MALDEF opened its doors here in San Antonio, Texas, and in Los Angeles, California, with its headquarters here in San Antonio, the birthplace of so many of our premier Latino civil rights organizations. We're here again in 2018 to commemorate that founding, to explore some of the work of MALDEF and its accomplishments over the years, and to look forward to the future, as we know that MALDEF today in 2018 is as needed as ever in promoting the civil rights of all Latinos living in the United States. I want to begin by thanking all of you who are joining us by live stream or who see this panel later, and those of you in the room. I also want to acknowledge that we have 50th anniversary co-chairs who are working with us to promote this commemoration throughout the coming months. Our co-chairs are Antonia Hernandez, Vilma Martinez, and Frank Herrera, here from San Antonio. I also want to acknowledge our San Antonio Gala, which will be tomorrow, chair, which is Coca-Cola Company, the co-chairs, Toyota and Walmart. And I want to thank all of our donors so far to our 50th anniversary campaign. Like all nonprofit organizations, MALDEF depends on the support of people throughout the country for the work that we continue to do. Even before this launch, we already have 25 donors who we call our champions of MALDEF's 50th anniversary, who have donated $50,000 or committed $50,000. And we are looking for more to fill out that roster and the much longer roster of champions at all levels of MALDEF's continued work. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. They're all very accomplished individuals. I will be highlighting in this brief introduction their MALDEF affiliations. So first we do have the Honorable Vilma Martinez, former ambassador to Argentina from the United States, and our former president and general counsel for 9 years from 1973 to 1982. Vilma has also been a board member of MALDEF both before she became president and general counsel and afterwards, and she has certainly been a long-standing friend to the leaders of MALDEF, including me. We also have with us today, next to Vilma, Al Kaufman, who was with MALDEF for over 20 years, I think nearly half of MALDEF's existence. And Al, of course, was in the San Antonio office making great contributions as a staff attorney, senior litigator, and ultimately Southwest Regional Counsel, particularly in the landmark education work that MALDEF was accomplishing in the state of Texas. And next to Al, we have our current Vice President of Litigation, Nina Perales, who now has been with MALDEF for 22 years and counting. So she too is close to half the existence of the organization. And finally, next to Nina is our good friend Teresa Fey Bustillos, who was with MALDEF. She epitomizes my predecessor Antonia Hernandez's favorite phrase, once a Maldefian, always a Maldefian, because Teresa was with MALDEF through 3 different stints in various different roles, including culminating early in this century as our Vice President of Legal Programs. But she had 13 years with MALDEF in 3 different stints and 3 different roles, so she has a broad perspective of our work. And finally, I will join the panel, and I have now 21 years in 2 stints with MALDEF, including service as a staff attorney, regional counsel, vice president of litigation, and it has been my great honor for the last 9 years to lead MALDEF as its president and general counsel. We have with us an esteemed moderator, someone with experience across the country, who we all have worked with in his various hats as an accomplished reporter and commentator on issues of civil rights, public policy, and politics across country. Ricardo Pimentel joined the San Antonio Express News in May of 2011. He sits on the newspaper's editorial board, coordinates a Sunday commentary section, and writes a weekly column on public policy. He's formerly a columnist and editorial page editor at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. He has been a managing editor at the Stockton Record and Tucson Citizen, and an executive editor at the San Bernardino County Sun. He was a nationally syndicated columnist at the Arizona Republic, obviously a place of much MALDEF work over the years. He has held various reporting or editing positions in San Bernardino, Fresno, San Diego, and Sacramento, and he was a Washington, D.C. correspondent for McClatchy newspapers, covering Congress, the Supreme Court, and federal agencies. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our moderator, Ricardo Pimentel.
Well, we'll get right to the questions. Welcome. Welcome to San Antonio. Some of you live here. So here's the first question to the group, please. Talk a bit about how, and more importantly, why MALDEF got started in 1968, and talk also about its San Antonio roots. Let's start with Teresa.
Okay. So, I'm from California. So I really worked the entire time in the California offices, but I did oversee the work nationally that the organization did. And, I think having that perspective, what it showed me and taught me is that I could really see how the roots of being in Texas, especially as a California person, how the roots in Texas really shaped the way that MALDEF was structured and the way we did our work. And one sign of that, and we were unusual at the time, and I think we still are, we had 5 regional offices. A lot of other civil rights organizations had a main office, maybe a second office. And I think having those Texas roots, Texans understand how different these issues can look in the various communities around the state. And it's such a diverse state that having those Texas roots made us understand that we couldn't just have a national office and really think we were going to address the rights of Latinos across this country. So that was a real sign to me. I think the second sign that I learned about Texans was that, Texans are plain speakers, speak the truth, and they don't mind a good fight. And so I also saw that in the roots of MALDEF, because when I thought about a lot of our public policy work in particular, and I saw the role that I think MALDEF staff played and I myself played in many issues around different public policy issues, I'd say, we were always that voice that was about the position on the issue, not just about trying to get something passed or winning on an issue. We were always about this issue. And I think that was our litigation experience gave us that standing to be about the issue. And I think those Texas roots about really saying, no, this is important and we're going to stand up for what we think is the right answer rather than the expedient.
At the beginning, why a Mexican-American organization and not a Latino organization or pan-minority organization? Anybody?
Well, Vilma?
I'd like to address that.
Okay.
I am from San Antonio.
Yep.
And I remember the founding of MALDEF. I was tangentially involved. I graduated Columbia Law School in 1967. That year, Pete Tijerina, and I think it was Al Peña, came to New York to talk to my then boss, Jack Greenberg, to talk about starting a similar organization. So I was a bit involved in those conversations and in the preparation of the proposal to the Ford Foundation to get MALDEF founded. You ask why? Well, I'll tell you why. Why? It's because growing up here in the 50s, there was blatant segregation of Mexican-American children into Mexican schools. There were many places where Mexican-American school children were not permitted to go beyond the 7th grade for educational opportunities. There were limited employment opportunities for Mexican-Americans. There were many places that no Mexicans need apply signs. As a child, I remember that I was supposed to go to Landa Park with a church group to go swimming, and all of a sudden it changed, and I finally cross-examined the priest to find out why couldn't we go to Landa Park. Well, it was because Mexicans weren't allowed. The work that had been done, and I was thinking about Hernandez v. Texas, the first Supreme Court case that said Mexican Americans were a discrete minority group entitled to the protections of the 14th Amendment, came from Texas. It was done by 2 Latino lawyers on their own, Gus Garcia and Carlos Cadena, and there were people like Jimmy De Anda who did the Corpus Christi school desegregation case. Pete Tijerina became very upset. He knew that history, and Pete was very upset that even in his day, the juries did not have Mexican American people on the jury roster. So he believed strongly that we, Mexican Americans, needed an institution that could fight institutionalized racism. So that's how I see what led to the founding of MALDEF.
Anyone?
Ricardo, I'd like to address another part of your question, which was why a Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. It's important to remember that 50 years ago, really the Latino population in this country was not the population that it is today. It was concentrated in the southwestern United States, which had been a part of Mexico until the middle of the 19th century, with pockets of significant population in Chicago, in Florida, and in New York. But the main overwhelming majority of Latinos in this country at the time were either Mexican American and then much smaller a Puerto Rican community in another part of the country. So really, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund was focusing on the largest, predominant, overwhelming Latino population in the country at the time. Now, Mexican Americans still make up 60% of the Latino population in this country today, but obviously we now have a much more diverse set of countries of origin for the Latino population. But MALDEF has long been a pan-Latino organization. But in part, recognizing our history that we're commemorating now, we maintain the name, MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. We are striving to brand the acronym MALDEF, but we will retain the name for historical reasons, though we have been a pan-Latino organization serving the entire Latino country, Latino community in the nation for the vast majority of our history. But we'll retain the name for historical reasons, and much like the NAACP, which you never hear spelled out, but maintains the name for historical reasons, we will always be MALDEF. But MALDEF is a champion for the entire Latino community, though our origins were in the community here in Texas and throughout the Southwest that was facing the kind of blatant segregation and discrimination that Vilma has described.
I want to add a little bit more about San Antonio. It's, excuse me, there was such a concentration of activists and energy here in San Antonio in the 60s. And MALDEF started here, and so did IDRA, Southwest Voter Registration Project, Mexican American Communities College, COPS, Mexican American Unity Council, Raza Unida Party, Mexican American Students Organization, all started here, and all between mid-60s and mid-70s, because there was such a concentration of energy, because there had been such a concentration of racism. And as my friend David Montejano said in his book, people are still fighting the Alamo in Texas. And it's still here, by the way, the Alamo's still there. There's still fights going on. So I think that all of that energy and all of the civil rights movement of the 60s translated in San Antonio to MALDEF and to all of these other organizations, which created a real sort of a synthesis and the symbiosis of energy here. And
Because the discrimination was more blatant here, or was it pervasive everywhere?
I haven't really lived, I grew up here, and I know it's pervasive here, because I remember the names we used to call the Mexican American kids in my high school, in my elementary school, Alamo Elementary, so the names that were used. So I've seen that history. I think it was more blatant here. I think that the racism was a little bit more subtle and indirect in other places. But in Texas, as I think Teresa said, let's talk straight. Well, they talk straight about racism as well. So I think that's one of the reasons why there's such a reaction to it in creation of these organizations.
Tom?
Well, I think that there was blatant discrimination and segregation across the Southwest. We know that some of the first, prior to MALDEF's founding, some of the first challenges to de jure school segregation were in Southern California, in Orange County and in San Diego. But I do agree that Texas is very much a part of the South, and there's no denying that. And the same traditions of Jim Crow that existed throughout the Deep South against the African American community happened here against African Americans and against Mexican Americans. And there is no way to ignore that Texas is part of the South and had that tradition here. So it did perhaps make it more systematized and blatant than in other parts of the Southwest. But in other parts of the Southwest, this was simply accepted into the 60s and 70s and beyond, that you could discriminate against Mexican Americans, that you could discriminate against Latinos with impunity. And that's why the existence of MALDEF beginning in 1968 to try to take anti-discrimination laws that really had been developed primarily for the African American community and make sure that they were useful for the Mexican American and Latino community to challenge the similar, though not exactly the same, but the similar discrimination that they face in education, employment, in voting, in housing, in you name it. Similarly pervasive, but trying to adapt laws that were not necessarily designed for this community, but certainly had to be useful and serviceable for the Latino community.
And just to add to that,
Sure.
I also haven't found in my work at MALDEF to be helpful to figure out what's worse, what community is worse, what area is worse. It was bad. It was bad everywhere. I mean, I grew up in a home where Mexicans were not allowed to live. And so I had to grow up lying and saying I was Hawaiian. And I didn't even know where Hawaii was. And that was I was in Los Angeles. So, you know, we all have, my mother has these stories. You know, we all have these stories that we grow up with. But I think the point is, building on a point that Vilma made, what MALDEF brought is a real structural addressing of discriminatory structures that were really keeping Mexican Americans, Latinos separated, down, lack of opportunities, inability to move forward. And that's the muscle that we brought that was sorely needed in the Latino community. It was really not just individual cases, but it was facing structural discrimination against Latinos, and we found plenty of it.
Nina, you want to jump in there?
Oh, no, I'm relishing the fact that it's very rare that I'm one of the youngest people on the panel. I was not around at the founding, so I'm going to let the folks who've been here longer answer those questions.
Okay. We'll let you answer some other questions.
We all hold your lack of wisdom against you.
And we're not going to do these cases chronologically, but because they're all important. But let's start with you, Nina. So there have been many landmark cases since the founding. Among them was Lulac versus Richards. And so talk about that case and tell us also about Farmers Branch, which is a little more recent.
Oh, okay. Well, it's Lulac versus Perry, because
Perry.
at the time our governor was Rick Perry. For those times. And so what I love about this case is that it kind of sits in the middle of a number of cases that punctuate MALDEF's history and that have to do with voting rights. Al was just reminding me a few minutes ago before we started that he arrived at MALDEF shortly after MALDEF had won a big Supreme Court decision called White versus Register, which was about structural discrimination, as you mentioned, against Mexican Americans. And the Mexican Americans in question in that case were from San Antonio. They were from the west side. And this was about the way to dilute the Mexican American vote by holding at-large elections, county-wide elections for state representative. And of course, the court's rulings eventually led to having districts, the districts that we know today for state representative in all of our large counties, right? There were also African Americans in that case, and the focus was on Dallas County. But it's very instrumental to read about White versus Register because of the way it talks about the Mexican American community on the west side as being isolated through all different kinds of discrimination, linguistically, educationally, and occupationally isolated in a way that interacted with the lack of an opportunity to cast an effective ballot. So it's a fantastic case, and it sort of punctuates the early years of MALDEF. And then, of course, in 2006, the case that I was more involved in, which was Lulac versus Perry, which was about another kind of systemic discrimination in elections, and that's manipulating district lines to disadvantage Latino voters. And in that case specifically, the Supreme Court said that the state of Texas had manipulated the district lines in a very large congressional district stretching from San Antonio to El Paso. So it was wonderful in a practical sense to get a ruling that would allow us to redraw the boundaries of Texas congressional districts in that part of the state. I did not realize until somewhat later that MALDEF was able to secure the very first ruling from the US Supreme Court in favor of Mexican American Latino plaintiffs on the merits in a case under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That was their first affirmative decision. And so that also tells you something about MALDEF and the muscle that we're able to bring, is to be able to secure first-time rulings in favor of Latinos under these enduring civil rights statutes
I
that
think
we
the
have.
I think the ambassador wants to jump in here too.
Well, I wanted to add on. No, I wanted to add on that we also did the first Section 5 lawsuits in Texas for
Section 5
Latinos.
The Voting
Both-
Rights Act.
Both local, under Voting Rights Act, both under local cases and state cases. So MALDEF is involved in both of those. And then you mentioned Lulac versus Richards. We had a lot of Lulac cases, sort of one of our sister organizations. And we represented them in a higher education case too in Texas, where we fought both segregation at all of the campuses in the state, as well as the lack of funding for the border area. And that was our higher education case back in, I guess it was like, let me see, 88 through 92.
What was the outcome?
The outcome was a tremendous change in funding for the state of Texas, a movement of about $500 to $600 million a year from the other universities toward the border area, and now almost equality in terms of funding between the border area, which we defined as Corpus to San Antonio to El Paso and south, against the rest of the state. We've gone from about 11% of the money to 18% of the money. So tremendous progress because of the lawsuit.
Ambassador, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to provide a little context to the voting rights discussion. But even before that, one of the things that MALDEF did early in its tenure was to figure out how to proceed. Because for a while, MALDEF responded to all the needs, or so many needs in the community, whether it was housing, police brutality, and there were just so many issues. The board took a very hard look at what MALDEF could do given its limited funding, and ultimately it decided to work in education, employment, the vote. A few years later, we added what we then called immigration, domestic civil rights crossover issues. Turning to voting rights, in 1975, the Voting Rights Act was up for renewal. It had been passed in 1965. It was considered the most effective civil rights piece of legislation ever passed. It did not cover Mexican Americans. It did cover Puerto Ricanos. Al Perez, who was then head of the DC office of MALDEF, called me. I was then head of MALDEF in San Francisco, and he said, we need to get involved. I said, oh, Al, you know, if people want to vote, they should just register and vote. So Al Perez didn't say anything. But a few days later, in the mail, I received this big packet of information to educate me about the rampant discrimination against people, especially in Texas, when it came to the vote. That even after people went many miles to register to vote, the registrar ran out of forms. Or on election day, there were ads, public service announcements, telling people, unless you are duly authorized and qualified and registered to vote, you should not vote lest you subject yourself to fine and imprisonment. These were ads on Spanish language radio. So I got the message, and Al Perez lined up some very brilliant then young lawyers, Tom Reston and David Tatel at Hogan and Hartson, to work with us and with people in San Antonio, like with Al and many others, and Willie Velasquez at the Southwest Voter Project, to build the case for creating and adding what were called the Mexican American amendments to the Voting Rights Act. We were opposed in that effort by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. We had to work to pull out of the Leadership Conference certain people, such as Joe Rao from the labor unions, the Japanese American Citizens League. They decided to support us. Ultimately, the Congressional Black Caucus, after having been visited by Latinos in their districts, decided to support us.
Why the objections?
The objection that the NAACP had, Clarence Mitchell articulated it, and he said, if we permit these amendments to the act, it would prejudice the constitutionality of the act because it would invite another constitutional challenge, and we don't want to lose the protections of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So I argued, as a lawyer trained at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, there was a severability provision in the act, which meant that if the Chicano Latino amendments were struck down, the act stayed in force. So over time, with some very careful work and testimony and visiting of various people, we were able to get the Voting Rights Act. And for many years, MALDEF, really with Joaquin Avila here in San Antonio, head of the office here and voting rights litigator, ultimately became head of MALDEF, made that act work for our community. It was very sad to me to see what happened subsequently in that Shelby versus Holder
We're going to get into that.
case. And so I have been thinking a lot about, you know, why am I back in the game here, right? Well, I'm back in the game because the issues are the same. They have new incarnations, voter ID laws, and you folks can speak more eloquently to today's version of the issues. So without those Section 5 protections, we are going to have to find a way to succeed.
Tom, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think it's important to see the through line from the work that MALDEF has done over the years to what we're doing today. And I want to mention two things. First, still today, we do Section 2 cases across the country. Nina is leading our efforts in the long running, it has to be the longest running series of cases in history if you go decade by decade, which is the renewed version of challenging Texas redistricting. Sometimes they do it twice in a decade, sometimes they do it once in a decade, but it seems to last the entire decade. So in 2018, we're still fighting that battle. But just last year, in December of 2017, we had a team in Kern County, California, which is where Bakersfield is, in the Central Valley, that went to trial to challenge, under Section 2, the failure to create what was clearly warranted by the growth of the Latino community, the failure to create a second Latino majority seat on the Board of Supervisors, a very powerful 5-person county Board of Supervisors. And at the end of that trial, early this year, we had a victory, proving that they had violated the Voting Rights Act, and they have now had to put in place a second Latino majority district that's going to a special election in this November. And what's amazing is that we in California sometimes are smug about how progressive we are today, but there in Kern County, the reaction even to the settlement of that case has been so vehement and nasty that the one Latina supervisor who was on the Board of Supervisors and who was cooperative in her testimony has now been targeted for retaliation. She's being prosecuted by the district attorney for alleged crimes that ordinarily are administratively handled by the Fair Elections Commission, not with criminal prosecutions by the district attorney. So it's very much the same kind of reaction we've seen over the years. But with respect to the expansion of the Voting Rights Act in the mid-70s to the Mexican American community, I would like to point out that after Shelby County, which was a decision in 2013 where the Supreme Court majority struck down the coverage formula for Section 5, which meant that jurisdictions, most importantly Texas and Arizona, for the Latino community, that many jurisdictions had previously had to receive pre-clearance for their electoral changes, no longer had to do that. And that meant that we would no longer be aware of some of the changes that were being made until they were already made. We would no longer have the Department of Justice, no matter who was in charge, reviewing to determine if those changes were discriminatory, and it makes it much more expensive and harder to challenge these changes in those jurisdictions that were covered. So clearly, the civil rights community, including the Leadership Conference today, is working hard to get a new coverage formula enacted by Congress. Many of our allies put together a history-based coverage formula, that if you had a certain number of findings of intentional discrimination over the years, that jurisdiction would be subject to preclearance, be covered by Section 5. Now, MALDEF, and MALDEF alone, came up with a supplemental coverage formula that we call known practices coverage. And it was out of a recognition that Texas and California aside, there are many parts of this country where the Latino community is new and only now reaching numbers that would threaten the powers that be. And therefore, it would take us too long to get a history of discrimination to trigger preclearance. So known practices coverage that MALDEF came up with and had included in one of the major pieces of legislation to react to Shelby County, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. Known practices coverage identifies the practices that we've seen over the years, used by jurisdiction after jurisdiction to target growing minority communities.
Absent the
Whether that-
history, you could bring a case.
Even without the history. So if you wanted to shift to an at-large system, for example, and you had a minority population above a certain threshold, you would have to have that change pre-cleared under this proposal. Now, the jurisdictions that have the history would have to pre-clear every one of their electoral changes. But any jurisdiction with a significant minority population would have to pre-clear just the known practices that we've seen over the years used to discriminate. And that was to serve the Latino and Asian American communities that don't have the long history in many jurisdictions. And I will tell you that our introduction of known practices coverage has elicited similar reactions that recall the stories that Vilma has shared with me over the years. We are told it's unconstitutional. It will call into question the constitutionality of the entire pre-clearance coverage formula. We don't want to run the risk of the rest of the pre-clearance coverage formula being struck down because of your proposal, which is unconstitutional. So some of the same forces that should be working with us in Congress have been the ones who have raised the objections. So there is a through line over a half century of the work that MALDEF does, and I'm proud that even today we're doing cutting edge work legislatively and in litigation that's consistent with our history, and I just wanted to raise those examples.
I wanted to add one more
Sure.
thing
Go ahead.
directly about the Shelby County decision. When the Supreme Court decided Shelby County and removed the coverage formula for us, the only part of the Voting Rights Act that was left specifically having to do with preclearance was a small provision that would allow a jurisdiction to be placed under a preclearance obligation, but only if you could prove intentional racial discrimination through a trial. And I'm happy to say that MALDEF won the first of those rulings in what is called a contested bail-in action in 2016, I think it was. I'm looking for my younger attorneys who have a better memory than me. And it was a case that we filed here in Texas, outside of Houston, in a city called Pasadena, Texas. And it had a thriving and growing Latino population that was increasing in its political power. And as soon as the Supreme Court decided the Shelby case, the mayor announced to anybody who would listen, the Department of Justice can't tell us what to do anymore. And then Pasadena enacted changes that were very discriminatory. We knew that there would be certain jurisdictions that would pounce once they were let out from under these obligations. And in response, we were able to represent members of the community in a lawsuit that was successful, not only improving vote dilution, but improving intentional racial discrimination that persuaded the judge to place Pasadena back under the preclearance obligation for approximately, I believe, 6 more years through the next redistricting.
Well,
for that
this
city.
is allegedly 2018, not 1965. So why are these things so entrenched? Why are you guys, thank God you are, still fighting these battles?
Well, these voting rights battles really are about power. They're about who has the decision-making power in jurisdictions, whether that's a city like Pasadena, Texas, a county like Kern County, or a state legislature in Texas or any other state. And we've battled redistricting in recent decades in Illinois and Arizona and other states as well. So when it's about power and people feel threatened, then they become entrenched. And unfortunately, sometimes those entrenched powers find it convenient to target the minority community that is growing into a size that it should be welcomed into participation, should be welcomed into power. And instead they resist and they use intentional discrimination and sometimes unintentional, the same practices that have been used before. And we have to guard against that, because the fact is that's human nature in some ways, that when a new group is gaining power, there's fear. And sometimes you have political leaders like Donald Trump, like Jan Brewer in Arizona, like Pete Wilson way back in the 1990s in California, who exploit those unspoken fears about the rise of a new group, and they trigger and often lead the discrimination, whether it's in voting or anti-immigrant lawmaking or education cutbacks or you name it. They are involved in exploiting those fears of demographic change that then trigger violations of our civil rights.
I want to quote Mr. Tijerina, his comment at the 20th anniversary report. Pete said, "The times are completely different, but unfortunately many of the institutional problems remain the same. MALDEF's work is as important as ever. MALDEF will continue to be recognized as the legal arm for civic and community organizations," to answer your question about why now in 2018.
I also want to add to that there's a lot of researchers have documented what's called a racial generation gap. And what you see when you study different communities is that, like today, for example, you see a white aging population, yet you see a much younger Latino population. And this causes a racial generation gap because the aging white population doesn't always relate to the issues or their perceptions of what these young Latinos are. They may think they're all just illegal immigrants. They can't relate to them. They're just using services that the white aging population needs at this point in time. So it becomes this racial generation gap. And then that plays out in voting and decisions. And we can go through many examples of where those decisions have enacted such laws like Proposition 187 in California, 227, 209, just a whole series of propositions, all related to this racial generation gap that is allowed to go forward because of because of these voting rights issues. When you don't have the Latino vote or you don't have other minorities with the right to vote, then these sorts of decisions, play a big role, and we see the implications of all that. And that's why voting rights is just seminal to many other rights. It's like the driver of many other rights. If you have that, then a lot of other issues play out differently.
Speaking of recurring problems, Al, let's go to Edgewood for a moment.
Yeah.
So Edgewood versus ISD versus State of Texas. You were in the thick of that. And Al, by the way, is going to have an op-ed in my newspaper Sunday on voting, redistricting. So just a plug for Al. Another important case was Edgewood, and you were in the thick of that. It was about inadequate public financing of schools, MALDEF 1. But talk about the aftermath, too.
Well, MALDEF did win, and it was an important victory, and I think we achieved a great deal more equity than there's ever been before. To some extent, the problem has been that now the state doesn't want to fund schools at any level. So partially, I think it's because there's now equality for the funding. It's going out to everybody, much closer to equality than there's ever been before. And now they're fighting what they call the adequacy battle. But in terms of these long-term problems, one of the issues in Edgewood was that the poor districts were always known as Mexican-American districts. In the views of people in Texas in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the poor districts were Edgewood and El Paso and the Valley districts. And I do think that was one of the reasons why the system was continued for as long as it was, because they felt that those folks just don't deserve all this new money, and we're not going to fund them.
Did Robin Hood arise out of Edgewood?
Yes, Robin Hood did rise. In fact, Dr. Albert Cortez and I drew up the first recapture, we don't call it Robin Hood, Jim, recapture system, and it's still the basis of it now. The problem is now the state's getting about $1 billion to $1.5 billion per year from it, and they can't afford to give it up. In addition, if they did give it up, the inequalities would be out of sight. So you've got these combating forces.
Go ahead.
So I just want to again say there's a through line for all of the work. Al was there at the beginning with Edgewood, but again, I had the impression in Texas that it's like Groundhog Day every decade. Not only do we have to relitigate redistricting every decade, but it seems like every decade we have to do another version of Edgewood in Texas to try to achieve greater equity and greater adequacy in the education funding for our Latino and Latina students. And I know that that has happened decade after decade. I think we're up to half a dozen or more Edgewood like cases here in the state of Texas. But I also want to say that we're still doing that work in other parts of the country. So very recently, we have a team from our San Antonio office that went to New Mexico and had a victory after trial there, the first case in the state of New Mexico to establish that the New Mexico Constitution guarantees an equal and adequate education to all students in the public school system. Now, we're still working out how that's going to result in changes, because there's always resistance. There's the governor today in New Mexico, but who's not going to be governor in 2019 because she's termed out, but there's a governor who's resistant, wants to appeal. We have to really work at getting at a remedy. But to have that case, as you said, it's 2018, but to have that case in this year, for the first time established for New Mexico Latino and Latina kids, that there is a right to equity and adequacy in public education is really critical. And there are more states that we have to take on, and we're looking at them all the time. But it all starts with the work in Texas on Edgewood, and even before that, on other education issues like segregation. And Vilma could tell you about the early years where we were still facing the challenge of segregation. And remember, MALDEF was founded 14 years after Brown versus Board of Education, but still the battles about segregation. We still have on our docket today, I think Nina may know better than me, we still have segregation cases in Texas that are still alive. We have a segregation case that is still alive in Tucson, Arizona, and it's 2018. So there's always a through line of the work that MALDEF's doing, which is why it's so important that to have an organization that's been around for 50 years and going to stick around for another 50 to go.
Okay, Al, so we had a Texas Supreme Court ruling that said our education financing system is crap, but constitutional. How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, there are 9 justices on there who don't give a damn.
Okay.
It's hard to go much farther than that. I think that the state eventually got tired of the litigation. I think the Supreme Court got tired of it, and the legislature got tired of it. We did the first one. It was such a shock to them, and that they lost. And then when they saw the facts, which were so blatant, they decided to make some changes, which we accomplished out of the first case. Much harder case now. By the way, the records MALDEF put on the later cases are much better than anything we ever did. They relitigated the case in the 2000s and the 1990s, and both those cases were just the most beautiful records. I love good records you've ever seen. But the Supreme Court had changed, so they were much less likely to be amenable to finding that case. So right now the problem is that the state generally doesn't want to put enough money into education, and the wealthier districts are still fighting any effort to get farther toward equality. And both those things are going to keep going on for a long time, and very difficult unless you change the political situations.
Ambassador, there was also Plyler, and you were there. Tell us what happened there.
Is my microphone working? Because
Yeah.
oh, good. Plyler v. Doe. I remember reading what we call litigation review memorandum, because MALDEF decided, we cannot fight every case, so we tried to get an analysis of what was the likelihood of success. Was this a case that was going to be settled, or is this a case that we're going to have to take all the way to the Supreme Court? And I was looking at that piece of work. As you may know, it dealt with a Texas statute which said that undocumented children had to pay $1,000 per year per child tuition to attend public schools, even though the parents paid into the sales tax and other tax systems that funded public education in the state of Texas. So we looked at that very, very carefully, because we concluded it would not be settled. It would go all the way. I personally remember talking to Peter Roos in my office in San Francisco after I read that, and I said, Peter, we're going to lose this case, but you should file it anyway. And so he did, and they did a wonderful job and got that statute struck down. And this is why undocumented children had the chance for a public school education. At that time, I was on the board of the University of California. And Wilson Wiles, who was superintendent of public instruction, was an ex officio member of that board. And so I went to him and I said, Wilson, you know, MALDEF is filing this lawsuit in Texas over this issue of educating undocumented children. And my question for you is, what are you going to do about educating undocumented children in California? His response was, if they come to school, we will educate them. So we didn't have to sue anybody in California until 187 was passed, at which point we did sue them and won. And at that point, I was in private practice and representing LA USD and San Francisco USD, and we actually got the first TRO on the K through 12 aspects of 187. That is the backstory of Plyler v. Doe.
187, I was in California then. Tom, so were you. So 187 was an attempt to block undocumented immigrants from certain services. And another win, but what happened?
Hard fought win, but one that set an important precedent, I think, that is now used across the country to challenge anti-immigrant laws. But at the time, I remember when we were thinking and strategizing about it and working with our co-counsel, Teresa was our vice president and really looking at the strategy as well. But the main claim that we were pursuing, that this law was preempted by federal law, that the Supremacy Clause meant that we could have one immigration policy nationwide, and California, no matter how much it disagreed with that immigration policy, couldn't come up with its own. But at the time, that was not a well-established theory. There was support for it, and it's certainly very logical that we couldn't be one nation if we allowed each state to have its own immigration policy. But at the time, it was not well-established precedent. And I think that's important to note. This was a challenge not just to Plyler, which it was directly by the authors, written in part to challenge the Plyler ruling and seek to set up a test case to go to the Supreme Court. But it would have affected, as you remember, Ricardo, every government service that you can think of: healthcare, social services, even law enforcement services, higher education, as well as K through 12. And it would have sought to bar all undocumented immigrants, but it would have done so in a way that also impacted everyone. Every person would have to potentially prove their status if they were reasonably suspected of being undocumented. They would have to go to extra efforts to prove their entitlement, and in the meantime could be denied services, could be reported to the then INS, could be reported to the state government, could be sent a ridiculous letter that basically says the state of California thinks you're undocumented, so change your status or leave. It was a whole set of over-the-top efforts to target the immigrant community, really built around punishing that community and making them into a wedge issue, making undocumented immigrants into a wedge issue that the then Governor Pete Wilson did exploit for his re-election. But I think what's happened in the almost quarter century since then, in a change of California's politics, in the continued use of the preemption claim against things like Arizona's SB 1070 that MALDEF was also involved in a case like Texas's SB 4 that we're still involved in. But all of that has really been an evolution and development of the law that I think it's fair to say MALDEF made a major contribution to that development of the law. I used to tell folks, and still do, of course, when I go talk to even to law students now, none of them can even remember Prop 187. They were all born after it was passed. And
Yeah, that happens.
But I would say to them, when I was in law school, preemption was not a civil rights issue. The Supremacy Clause was not a civil rights issue. I would say in law schools today, students understand that if you're looking at something like immigrants' rights or other rights, that preemption is a civil rights claim. It's not just the 14th Amendment, equal protection, due process, the Bill of Rights, but the Supremacy Clause is also a civil rights claim today.
And this is why, if I may add, why MALDEF is so important, because it does attract incredible legal talent, and you see 4 of them here today, and there are others, of course, who formulate these strategies. It's not easy to come up with these new ideas. And I know I read a law review article that Tom wrote about those precise issues of using non-civil rights thinking for resolving civil rights issues. I've read law review articles that Nina has written about how the Voting Rights Act has developed. And if you sent me some of your articles, Al, I would read them.
Okay.
So
Still the boss.
for me, it's just a source of real pride that MALDEF attracts so much talent with so little financial remuneration, if truth be told.
So of course, I just have to say it's actually 5 creative
Well,
MALDEF lawyers up here. She was just being humble and modest as she usually is, because the rest of us were saying, is she leaving me out? Which one?
I also want to talk about another side to these propositions, and also to Vilma's point where she said about MALDEF does attract incredible lawyers. And to be a lawyer about MALDEF is very different than in a law firm, because you not only have to be an incredible litigator and think of very creative legal strategies, you've also got to be really good working in communities. You've got to be really good going out there in the communities, really good coalition builder. You have to have an incredible set of skills in order to work out MALDEF. And 187, 209, 227, these 3 initiatives in California, each 2 years apart, had another story beyond the litigation. We did litigation in all of those cases. We were most successful in 187, but we had other kinds of successes in the other 2. Mm-hmm. But behind each one was a huge effort by MALDEF staff to go out there and figure out what were the messages. Because if you read what was on the ballot about 187, it was, well, we agree immigration is out of control, but this is just not the right answer. That's what we were facing in the public arena in California. So of course we had to sit there as lawyers and say, well, what's the real strategy here? Because we both had to have a litigation strategy and a strategy about how do we really build and educate a coalition that is going to be able to oppose these issues going longer term. And it's not going to be that immigration is a problem and this is a bad solution. It's going to be that we need to come together as African Americans, Latinos, Asians, whites, everybody needs to see this is bad for California as a whole. So this is what we were doing also as lawyers, thinking about what are our messages. We used to have meetings and we'd all say, okay, where did you speak? Where did you speak? How did that go? What went over well? What was a complete disaster? So we were also communications people talking about, we did all of these things to each of these big litigations. We had a whole strategy on the right messages. Mm-hmm. Who was the right person to go out there? We all went to African American churches. We all debated Ron Unz, whoever. We debated all of them. And so this is the work of a MALDEF lawyer. It's not just the litigation. It's all this work behind the scenes. We've all been in homes with 10 people in that home of Latino immigrant families there. We all do that. That's what a MALDEF lawyer is.
We're almost out of time, but I think I want to talk about the future. Obviously, as you've heard, these problems have not gone away. MALDEF is still here, thank God. So what is the future of MALDEF?
Well, I'm certainly happy to start. I think the future of MALDEF lies in taking its legacy that we've discussed here, and there's so much more to it, and following it through to the future. And that's the creativity in the legal claims, that's recognizing where the law does not quite fit. I mentioned that in the beginning it was about taking civil rights laws that were designed primarily for the African American community and making sure they could work for the Latino community. But when it comes to immigrant rights, it was about trying to take laws that were not designed to target discrimination directed against immigrants. So I'm not racist, they would always say, we're not racist, we're just worried about the undocumented immigrants, when it's clearly about the Latino community. So we would have to find ways to use the law to tackle those proxies for Latino identity, whether it was immigration status, whether it was language in English-only rules in Prop 227, whether it was some of the other stereotypes about our community. And today we face the same. And we've got to be looking for, and I think we are, looking for those opportunities to ensure that we're still serving the immigrant community as anti-immigrant laws from the federal government these days, and policies take different form. Again, there's a through line from the work on 187 to MALDEF being among the sponsors of legislation here in Texas and in California.
Have you ever had as
create-
hostile an administration?
No, I think this is the most anti-Latino presidential administration we've ever faced. But the through line is we were working thereafter, TEDESA was leading efforts to get in-state tuition for undocumented students, the Plyler kids. So it goes from Plyler 187 to getting in-state tuition for the Plyler beneficiaries. All of us are beneficiaries, truly, the entire country, of taking all of those kids and getting them the education and fulfilling their ambitions and abilities. But to getting in-state tuition, there was a rivalry between California and Texas, and ultimately California got theirs passed first, enacted first, and then nothing more. But then to MALDEF in our DC office being among the leaders in putting together the DREAM Act, which would provide permanent relief, permanent status to those Plyler kids, dreamers, who come to this country as undocumented when they're youth. Still fighting for the DREAM Act. And then it comes all the way through today, where we have fought in the courts to sustain DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Nina took with her team victory that no one else foresaw recently, where Judge Hainan denied a preliminary injunction that many of your colleagues, I had conversations with them, don't assume the outcome's going to be that an injunction will be issued. And they all insisted, well, it's the same judge. that
Surprised
enjoined
the heck
DACA.
out of me.
And we got that victory, so DACA still lives today. So there's a through line. But the future is about continuing that through line and all of them on voting, education, employment, and immigrants' rights, but also recognizing the new challenges to shape the law. So I will end by saying we have spent a number of years looking at and developing what might be called multiple bias discrimination. Others now call it intersectional discrimination, where someone faces discrimination not just because they're Latino, but because of some other identity, whether that's their gender, their orientation, LGBTQ status, whether they're transgender, whether they have a disability. But unfortunately, when someone is going to discriminate against, for example, someone who identifies as LGBTQ, they're going to first target the Latino. So we've had a number of cases like that. I want to mention just one case we have now, pending before the Supreme Court. We're waiting for their decision on a request, a petition for certiorari that they take the case, which is a case out of Indiana, where we are working with the Transgender Law Center to represent an immigrant, transgender, Indiana resident who would like to change his name. But Indiana has a unique law that says you must be a United States citizen. A law enacted in 2010 says you must be a United States citizen to legally change your name. Otherwise, your petition to change your legal name must be denied if you are not a United States citizen. And our client has been able to change the gender identifier on all of his identification, but still has the name that he was born with, and it does not match his gender identity. And so it has very real repercussions that as a non-citizen he can't legally change his name. And that's the kind of thing that I am proud that MALDEF is doing. We are looking for where discrimination against an immigrant and someone who's transgender coincide, to make sure that we have laws that can address those circumstances of multiple bias discrimination or intersectional discrimination. So I think the future is about creating new law, creating new claims, about ensuring that the many new and different ways that the Latino community faces discrimination can be successfully challenged in court, can be successfully used to deter the discriminators from discriminating in the first place.
Anyone else want to jump in on the future?
I guess I do. I want to say that I've watched MALDEF pretty closely now for, I guess, 45 years, and it's better than it's ever been. It's the best organization it's ever been. And the challenges are even greater. I'm not going to say we did lawsuits, they were easy, but compared to today, they were like, shooting fish in a barrel. The school finance system was so bad, I think any competent lawyer could have won that. The single member district case situation was so bad, almost any lawyer, good lawyer could have won that. So now it's so much more difficult. The law is much more complex, so many more barriers, and the opposition is so well organized, and they're doing just a wonderful job. So To quote my friend Michael Olivas, he said, if you don't contribute to MALDEF, you're really a sinvergüenza.
Go ahead, Teresa.
Yeah, in 2000 I left MALDEF, very tough decision, and I became a funder, and I've been a funder in philanthropy ever since. And when I think about the future of MALDEF, and I'm with a lot of funders and other philanthropies, I find myself always being the one that really points out why we need a MALDEF, because the view today by many funders is that, well, why don't we just address immigration issues? Why do we have to look at it through a Latino lens? Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we just look at employment? Why do we have to? I get asked this question all the time by other funders. And, the answer back is because society doesn't practice discrimination that way. Society doesn't just say, well, we're just going to discriminate generically. I've never seen that in my career. And so you do need a MALDEF that really understands the way discrimination plays out on the Latino community. And that is a unique perspective that is still needed today, and it's not an exclusionary perspective. When I was doing a lot of public speaking, when I was at MALDEF, I used to, in front of big, very multi-ethnic audiences, say, you really want to hear from a Latino, because when you're a Latino, what you realize is that your fellow Latinos come from every race and every ethnicity. So you actually understand what that means. And you're going to be inclusive. You're not going to then say, well, we've got ours, we can be exclusive. You're going to be inclusive. And that's that voice, and that's that perspective you want leading litigation, public policy advocacy, and community lawyering. So that's why MALDEF is needed, and that's the case that I make all the time, to other funders and to my own organization.
Anyone else?
I wanted to add that I quoted Peter Herina from the 20th anniversary report. Now I'm going to quote myself. So I concluded by saying, I take pride in what I was able to do, and more in the knowledge that MALDEF will capture the hearts and minds of new generations of Mexican American people in this country. I sincerely believe that.
Okay. Well, thank you. Please thank my panelists. I've been writing about this stuff for a very long time, and MALDEF has been a go-to source for me. I didn't know about Nina until I got here, and then saw she was in the thick of voting rights and redistricting, and so it's, but I've noticed this is a trend here. Texas comes up a lot. So please don't go away. I hope MALDEF does have a future. Thank you very much for coming.